The Willow Bend River marked the beginning and end of every day, a muddy, persistent artery of life in the Arizona Territory. For Abigail, all 18 years of her life had been measured by its currents. In the dry season, it was a lazy brown ribbon you could almost wade across. After the summer rains, it swelled into a churning beast that chewed at its banks and threatened the ferry landing. Today, it was calm, reflecting a sky so wide and blue it made you feel small and temporary. Abigail sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, a charcoal stick still in her fingers, the rough paper on her lap holding the faint outline of a distant butte. The air smelled of dust, damp earth, and the faint, sweet scent of the cottonwoods that gave the town its name. Life here was a simple, hard rhythm. You rose with the sun, you worked until your bones ached, and you found your peace in the small things, the taste of fresh water from the well, the sound of a fiddle from Widow May's saloon on a Saturday night, the shared nod with a neighbor across the dusty Main Street. It was a life Abigail understood. She had plans, quiet ones she held close to her heart. She imagined a small house of her own one day, a garden, perhaps a husband who was kind and smelled of sawdust, like the carpenter's son, Samuel. A life as predictable and steady as the river in the dry season. A whistle from the ferry broke the stillness. "Mr." Henderson was guiding the clumsy wooden raft across, a single wagon and a pair of weary travelers on board. Willow Bend was a stopover, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere better, somewhere with gold or greener pastures. Few stayed. The town itself was little more than a single street of clapboard buildings, a general store, a post office that also handled the telegraph, a church with a slightly crooked steeple, the saloon, and a handful of houses. It was a town holding its breath. Caught between the old world of the Apache, who had lived on this land for generations, and the new world of miners and railroad men pushing west with relentless hunger. For now, there was peace. A fragile peace, brokered by men in offices far away and maintained by a tense, unspoken agreement. The Apache of the Red Mesa clan, led by a man they called Tyan, kept to their lands. The people of Willow Bend kept to theirs. The river was the line. Abigail packed her charcoal and paper into a leather satchel, her thoughts drifting. Lately, the peace had felt thinner, like worn fabric. Men with surveying equipment had been seen upriver. Owen Mallory, a name spoken in hushed, resentful tones, was buying up land claims for his railroad. And his partner, the government-appointed Indian agent Whitlock, was always sniffing around. His smile too wide and his eyes too narrow. As she walked back toward the main street, she saw Widow May sweeping the boardwalk in front of her saloon. May was a formidable woman with a laugh as loud as a thunderclap and a gaze that missed nothing. "Dreaming again, Abigail," she called out, her broom sending up a small puff of dust. Abigail offered a small smile. "Just watching the river, May." "The river's got nothing new to say. It is the same old story of moving on. You should be thinking about the church social Saturday. I hear Samuel has been asking after you." A faint warmth touched Abigail's cheeks. "I might go." "You might," May chuckled, leaning on her broom, "or you might let that boy wither on the vine. Do not be so timid, girl. Life out here eats the timid." She squinted toward the east, her good humor vanishing like a drop of water on a hot skillet. "And it looks like trouble is riding in for supper." Abigail followed her gaze. 3 riders were approaching. Not from the ferry road, but from the high plains. They were not cowboys or prospectors. They were Apache. They rode with an unnerving straightness, their bodies seeming to flow with the movement of their ponies. The dust they kicked up was the only hurried thing about them. Instantly, the town's rhythm broke. Doors creaked shut. Faces appeared in windows. Mr. Gable, the store owner, quickly began hauling his barrels of flour and sugar inside. The quiet hum of Willow Bend was replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Abigail's heart began to beat a little faster. Apache warriors did not come into town. Not like this. It was part of the agreement. The lead rider was a man with a face like carved rock, his long black hair held back by a simple leather band. He wore buckskin leggings and a plain cotton shirt, but he carried himself with an authority that needed no decoration. He and his companion stopped their horses in the center of the street, their dark eyes sweeping over the silent town. They looked at the crooked steeple, the saloon, the shuttered windows, as if taking inventory. Abigail's father, Thomas, stepped out of the post office, his face grim. He was a man made weary by the sun and worry. But he stood tall. Reverend Miller emerged from the church, his Bible clutched in one hand, his expression pleading for calm. The lead rider dismounted. He moved not with aggression, but with an unnerving purpose. He walked directly toward Thomas, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. "Thomas Finch," the rider asked. His voice was low and clear, his English precise, with only a trace of an accent. "I am him," her father replied, his voice tight. The rider held out a rolled piece of hide, tied with a leather thong. "I bring words from Tyan, leader of the Chiricahua of Red Mesa. This is a proclamation of the renewed treaty between our peoples." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the hidden watchers. A treaty renewal. That was all. But the tension did not fully dissipate. This was not the way such news was usually delivered. Usually, Agent Whitlock handled these things, with his official papers and condescending speeches. Thomas took the hide scroll, his hands hesitating for a moment before untying the thong. He unrolled it. Abigail stood frozen near the saloon, watching her father's face. She saw his shoulders sag. The color drained from his cheeks. He read the scroll, then read it again, his eyes wide with a look of stunned horror she had never seen before. "What is it?" Thomas Reverend Miller asked, stepping forward. Her father did not seem to hear him. He looked up, his gaze finding Abigail across the street. His eyes were filled with a terrible mix of sorrow and resignation. The Apache messenger spoke again, his voice carrying in the heavy silence. "The treaty holds. The peace between Willow Bend and the people of Tyan will be sealed, as is our custom in matters of great weight. It will be an alliance of blood, a joining of families. Tyan will protect this town, its trade, and its borders from those who would bring war to this valley. In return, the town will give a bride to seal the pact." He paused, his eyes following her father's gaze directly to her. "Tyan has chosen your daughter, Abigail Finch." The world fell away. The dusty street, the silent houses, the wide blue sky. It all dissolved into a meaningless blur. The only reality was the messenger's voice and the crushing weight of his words. A bride. For an Apache chief. The whispers started immediately. A venomous hiss from behind the closed doors and curtained windows. Abigail felt 100 unseen eyes on her, judging, pitying, condemning. Her mother, Martha, ran from their small house beside the post office and threw her arms around Abigail, as if she could physically shield her from the pronouncement. "No," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "You cannot. She is just a child." "She is 18, the messenger said, his tone unchanging. "A woman. Tyan's choice is made. It is a great honor. He is a great leader." "Honor?" The word sounded like a profanity. All Abigail could feel was a cold, paralyzing fear that started in her stomach and spread through her limbs, turning them to ice. This was not happening. It was a nightmare, a fever dream brought on by too much sun. She looked at her father, pleading with her eyes for him to deny it, to shout, to tear the scroll in two and send these men away. But he just stood there, his face a mask of defeat, the hide scroll hanging limply in his hand. "Leave us," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We must speak as a family." The messenger gave a slight, formal nod. "We will camp by the river. We wait for your answer until the sun is at its highest tomorrow. The honor of your word is at stake. Thomas Finch and the lives of your people." He mounted his pony with fluid grace, and without another word, he and his companions turned and rode back toward the river, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind them. The moment they were gone, the town seemed to exhale, and the whispers erupted into a low murmur. Abigail felt her mother pulling her toward their house, away from the prying eyes. Inside, the small parlor felt suffocating. The familiar smell of baking bread and dried lavender could not dispel the chill that had settled deep in her bones. "You will tell them no," Martha said, turning on her husband, her voice shaking with a fury Abigail had rarely seen. "You will tell them to go back to their mountain and leave us be. We have a treaty. We do not need this barbarism." "Martha, be quiet," Thomas said, sinking into his favorite armchair. He looked like an old man, the lines on his face etched deeper than they had been an hour ago. "I will not be quiet. They want to take our daughter." Abigail found her voice, though it felt like a stranger's. "Father, you did not agree to this, did you?" Her father would not meet her eyes. He stared at the floorboards, at the worn patch on the rug, at anything but her. That was his answer. The cold fear in her stomach twisted into a hot, sickening knot of betrayal. "How could you?" she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "How could you do this to me?" "You do not understand," he said, his voice heavy with a burden she could not yet comprehend. "Understand what?" she cried, the tears finally coming, hot and angry. "That you sold me, that you traded me for peace. What kind of peace is that?" "The kind that keeps you alive," he finally snapped, his head jerking up. The anguish in his eyes startled her into silence. "The kind that keeps this whole town from being burned to the ground and its people slaughtered." He rose from his chair and went to a small, locked wooden box on the mantelpiece. He fumbled with the key, his hands trembling slightly, and took out a folded piece of official-looking paper. It was not the Apache scroll. It was a document covered in dense, legal script, bearing the seal of the United States territorial government. He smoothed it out on the table. "This is the real treaty," he said quietly, "the one you know nothing about." Abigail and Martha stared at the paper. At the bottom, there were two signatures. One was her father's, his familiar, neat script. The other belonged to Agent Whitlock. "What is this?" Martha asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It is a devil's bargain," Thomas said, his gaze distant. "Whitlock came to me a month ago. He and that mining man, Mallory, they found something, up in the Silver Creek Canyon." "Silver," Abigail breathed. She had heard the rumors. More than rumors, a vein of it thick as a man's arm, running right under the ground the Apache considers sacred. "Mallory wants it. He is bringing in hired guns, a nasty outfit called the Black Spur Mercenaries, to clear the way. He plans to break the treaty, provoke a war, and in the chaos, take the canyon." He pointed a trembling finger at the document. "Whitlock is his man on the inside. He was supposed to declare the treaty null and void, claim the Apache were hostile. He would have the army in here before the week was out. It would be a slaughter. The Apache would fight to the last man for that land, and Willow Bend would be caught right in the middle. We would be wiped out." Abigail stared at him, her mind struggling to piece it all together. "So what does this marriage have to do with it?" "It is the one thing they did not plan for. It is an old Apache tradition, a marriage alliance. It creates a bond stronger than any paper treaty. As long as Tyan's wife is from this town, as long as she is my daughter, he is bound by honor to protect us, and we are bound to him. And no government agent, no mining company, can break that bond without revealing their treachery. This," he tapped the paper with Whitlock's signature, "this was my countermove. I agreed to endorse Whitlock's official reports, to keep quiet about his dealings, on one condition, that he would recognize and enforce a marriage alliance if Tyan offered one. He thought I was a fool. He never believed Tyan would do it." Her father looked at her then, and the full weight of his decision was in his eyes. "I gambled. Abigail, I gambled that Tyan was a man of honor who valued peace more than war. I gambled that he would see the trap being laid for both our peoples and seek a different path. And I gambled with you, because you were the only thing I had of value to put on the table." The room was silent save for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. The fear had not gone away, but now it was something different. It was larger, more complex. It was not just about her anymore. It was about the smirking face of Agent Whitlock, the greed of Owen Mallory, the lives of everyone in this town, and the fate of a people she had only ever known as shadowy figures across the river. She was not a victim of chance. She was a pawn in a grim, desperate game, placed on the board by her own father. She walked to the window and looked out. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Down by the river, she could just make out the small, flickering light of a campfire. They were waiting. The river, which had always been the edge of her world, was now a line she was being forced to cross. It was the border between the life she knew and a future so terrifying and unknown she could not begin to imagine it. Her choice, she realized, was not a choice at all. It was a sentence, handed down to save them all, and justice, it seemed, was to be built upon a foundation of her fear. The sun rose the next morning on a town that felt like a stranger. The familiar greetings were replaced by averted eyes and hurried whispers behind cupped hands. When Abigail stepped out of her father's house, dressed in a sturdy traveling skirt and blouse, a small bundle of her belongings in her hands, the silence on the main street was as heavy as a shroud. Her mother stood in the doorway, her face pale and tear-streaked, clutching a small wooden cross. Her father stood beside her, his expression unreadable, the lines of his face a roadmap of regret. There were no grand goodbyes, no tearful embraces in the street. The transaction had been made, and the town was now a spectator to its cost. Widow May was the only one who met her gaze. She stood on her boardwalk, arms crossed, and gave Abigail a slow, deliberate nod. It was not pity, but a kind of grim acknowledgement, a shared understanding of the hard choices the frontier demanded of its women. The gesture was a small, solid thing in a world that had turned to mist, and Abigail held on to it. The 3 Apache riders were waiting by the river, their ponies already saddled. The leader, whose name she learned was Dasoda, which meant Grey Wolf, watched her approach with the same impassive expression as the day before. He gestured to a sturdy-looking Mustang, its saddle simpler than the ones she was used to. There was no offer of help. She was expected to mount on her own, and she did. Her movements clumsy but determined, her cheeks burning under their watchful eyes. She did not look back at her parents or the town shrinking behind her. Looking back would break her. They rode east, away from the river and into the rising sun. The landscape shifted almost immediately. The familiar green of the cottonwood groves gave way to a vast, open expanse of rock and scrub. The world became a study in shades of brown and red, broken only by the pale green of sagebrush and the skeletal arms of ocotillo cacti reaching for a mercilessly blue sky. The silence was immense. It was not the quiet of a sleeping town, but a living, breathing silence that buzzed with the heat and the hum of insects. For the first 2 days, no one spoke a word to her. Dasoda and the other warrior, a stern man named Howe, rode ahead, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The 3rd rider, the youngest of the group, often fell back to ride near her. He looked to be her age, perhaps a year or 2 older. His face was leaner than the others, with a spark of something restless in his dark eyes. He had introduced himself with a single word, Nantan, which she later learned meant spokesman or chief. The title seemed too grand for his youthful energy, but he wore it with a quiet confidence. He did not speak to her either, but she felt his occasional glances, more curious than hostile. Her life was stripped down to the barest essentials, the rhythm of the horse beneath her, the gnawing ache in her muscles, the rationing of water from her canteen. the taste of dry jerky and hard biscuits at the end of the day. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her belly. But beneath the fear, something else was taking root, a hard, stubborn resolve. She would not cry. She would not complain. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would observe, she would learn, and she would survive. This was her new reality, and she would meet it on her feet, not on her knees. On the fourth day, the heat was a physical weight. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything, filling her nose and mouth, gritting between her teeth. They stopped to rest the horses in the scant shade of a rock outcropping. Nantan dismounted and, without a word, took her canteen and walked to one of the pack mules. He returned it to her, heavy and full of fresh water. "The sun is a strong hunter today," he said. His voice was lighter than DeSoto's, with a musical cadence. It was the first time one of them had spoken to her about something other than stopping or starting. "Yes," she managed to say, her throat raw. "Thank you." He gave a slight shrug, as if it were nothing, but his eyes lingered on her face for a moment. "Your town shoes are not friends with this land." Abigail looked down at her scuffed, worn leather boots. They were indeed falling apart, the soles separating from the uppers. A flicker of humor, dry and unexpected, touched her. "They are made for boardwalks, not for rocks." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "There are no boardwalks where we are going." The brief exchange was like a crack in a wall of ice. It did not change anything, but it let a little bit of light through. Later that afternoon, as they crested a low rise, DeSoto raised a hand, and the group halted. The air, which had been still, now carried a foul, sweetish odor of decay that made Abigail's stomach clench. Below them, in a wide, grassy basin, was a scene of such grotesque carnage that she could not at first comprehend it. Dozens upon dozens of buffalo lay scattered across the plains. They were not just dead. They had been mutilated. Their great, shaggy hides had been peeled from their bodies, leaving behind mountains of raw, bloody flesh to rot under the relentless sun. A black cloud of flies buzzed over the massacre, and the stench was overpowering. Abigail felt a wave of nausea. She had seen dead animals before, had grown up in a place where hunting was a part of life. But this was different. This was not hunting, it was desecration. It was a violation of something profound and essential. She saw the way the Apache warriors looked at the scene, their faces hardening into masks of cold, controlled fury. There was a deep, personal grief in their eyes, as if they were looking upon the bodies of their own kin. "White men," Nantan said, his voice low and tight with contempt. "They hunt with big guns from the train cars. They take the skin and the tongue and leave the rest for the vultures. They do not honor the life they take." He spoke of it as the ultimate sin, a profound disrespect for the world that sustained them. For the first time, Abigail felt a flicker of shared indignation. She saw the waste, the senseless destruction her own people were capable of, and she felt a pang of shame. This, she thought, was what her father's desperate bargain was meant to prevent. This was the greed of men like Owen Mallory made real, written in blood and rotting flesh upon the land itself. They rode on in a grim silence. The image of the slaughtered herd burned into her mind. The journey felt different now, less like a personal ordeal and more like a flight from a gathering storm. The world of Willow Bend, with its church socials and predictable rhythms, seemed 1,000 miles and 100 years away. The land grew rougher, the plains giving way to a maze of canyons and mesas that rose like ancient fortresses from the desert floor. The trail became a narrow, winding path, and they often had to dismount and lead their horses. One evening, as they made camp in a sheltered cove, Nantan sat across the small fire from her, sharpening the blade of a long knife. "You are quiet," he observed, not looking up from his work. "I have nothing to say," she replied. "A quiet woman is a good thing, the old ones say, but your silence is heavy. It has a bad taste, like water from a poisoned well." Abigail looked at him, surprised by his directness. "I am afraid," she admitted, the words tasting strange on her tongue. "Fear is a wise guide," he said, testing the edge of the blade with his thumb. "It tells you when to run and when to be still. Only a fool feels no fear." He finally looked up, his gaze steady. "Tayan is not a man to fear. He is a hard man, but he carries the weight of his people on his shoulders. That is a heavy burden. It leaves little room for cruelty." His words were meant to be reassuring. She knew, but they did little to soothe the cold knot in her stomach. A just man, a great leader, that is what they all said. But he was still a stranger, the king of a world she did not understand, and she was to be his bride. 2 days later, they were deep in the canyon lands. The air was cooler here, the rock walls rising so high on either side that they spent much of the day in shadow. They were traveling along a high ridge that overlooked a series of intersecting canyons. It was Hao, the silent warrior, who saw them first. He stopped his horse and pointed to a lower ridge across the chasm. At first, Abigail saw nothing but rocks and sparse vegetation. Then she saw the flicker of movement. A small group of men, 4 of them, were working with a tripod and other surveying equipment. They were white men, dressed in the practical canvas trousers and dusty shirts of laborers. Instantly, Dasoda and Nantan became utterly still, their bodies radiating a tense alertness. Dasoda spoke a few sharp words in his own language, and Nantan slid from his horse, pulling a long spyglass from his saddlebag. He motioned for Abigail to get down, to stay low behind a cluster of boulders. Dasoda and Hao moved away, disappearing into the rocks with a silent, ghostly swiftness that was both fascinating and terrifying. Abigail crouched behind the rocks, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nantan lay flat on a ledge above her, the spyglass pressed to his eye. She could hear the faint murmur of the men's voices carrying on the wind, but she could not make out the words. She watched them work, driving stakes into the ground, making notes in a ledger. They were mapping the land. After a long while, the men began to pack up their equipment. One of them unrolled a large sheet of paper, a map, to check their progress one last time. A sudden gust of wind, funneled through the canyon, caught the corner of the map and whipped it open, holding it flat for a few precious seconds. From her position, Abigail could see it clearly. She saw the familiar outline of the river valley to the west and the sharp, angular lines the men had drawn, marking their path. The lines snaked through the canyons, converging on a single, clearly marked point. And from Nantan's sharp intake of breath, she knew what it was before he even spoke the name, his voice a low, venomous whisper. Silver Creek. The words hung in the air, cold and hard as the rocks around them. It was real. Her father had not been exaggerating. The map was not just a drawing. It was a death warrant. It was a blueprint for the theft of a sacred place, a plan for a war that would swallow her whole world. The surveyors folded their map, oblivious to the eyes watching them from the ridge above, and began to make their way back down the trail. Nantan slid back from the ledge, his face grim, the youthful spark in his eyes replaced by the cold seriousness of a warrior. He looked at Abigail, and in his gaze, she saw that something fundamental had shifted between them. She was no longer just the white woman, the reluctant bride, the pawn in a political game. She was a witness. She had seen the proof with her own eyes. Her personal sacrifice was no longer a vague concept to secure a distant peace. It was now inextricably linked to the men with the map, to the vein of silver in the earth, and to the survival of the people who were leading her into the heart of their world. As she looked west, toward the setting sun, the direction of her old home, and then east, toward the rising mesas and her unknown future, she understood. The road to Red Mesa was not just the path to her wedding. It was the front line of a war that had already begun. After their discovery, the final day of the journey passed in a tense, purposeful silence. The sighting of the surveyors had changed the air between them. Abigail was no longer merely a passenger. She was a fellow witness to a shared threat. DeSoto and Howe treated her with a new, grudging respect, while Nantan's occasional glances were now filled with a kind of conspiratorial understanding. They were moving toward his home not just as captor and captive, but as reluctant allies united against a common enemy. They arrived at Red Mesa as the afternoon sun began to bleed toward the horizon, casting long shadows that felt like cool fingers on the hot stone. There was no grand entrance, no gate or wall. The settlement did not announce itself. Instead, it revealed itself slowly, like a secret whispered between the rocks. It was less a town built upon the land, and more a community woven into it. The dwellings, wickiups made of branches and hides, were nestled into the natural contours of the great red rock mesa, their curved shapes mimicking the boulders and junipers that surrounded them. They were so much a part of the landscape that from a distance, you would not have known they were there at all. Smoke from a dozen small fires rose in thin, lazy columns into the vast, clear sky. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting corn, and the clean, spicy scent of pine. The sounds were different here. There was no clang of a blacksmith's hammer or the rumble of wagon wheels. Instead, there was the murmur of voices in a language she did not understand, the laughter of children, the rhythmic thump of someone grinding corn, and the soft, percussive beat of a distant drum. It was a place alive with a quiet, steady pulse. As they rode into the main clearing, people stopped what they were doing to watch them. The faces were curious, guarded, but not openly hostile. She saw women tending to cooking pots, men mending tools, and children who stopped their games to stare with wide, dark eyes. She felt 1,000 pinpricks of scrutiny, and her own self-consciousness rose like a fever. She was the outsider, the white woman, the symbol of a fragile, distrusted peace. She kept her back straight and her gaze fixed on the space between her horse's ears, determined not to show the tremor in her hands. DeSoto led them to the center of the settlement, where a large, smokeless fire pit was ringed with smooth stones. He dismounted and spoke in his own tongue to a group of elders who had gathered. And then a path cleared through the small crowd, and she saw him. Tyon was not what she had expected. The stories that circulated in Willow Bend, fueled by fear and ignorance, had painted him as a hulking, savage figure, draped in war paint and animal skins. The man who stood before her was tall and lean, with a quiet dignity that was more imposing than any display of brute strength. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a plain, dark blue cotton shirt. His black hair, streaked with a few strands of gray at the temples, was long and unbound. His face was all sharp angles and weathered lines, a map of a hard life lived under a harsh sun. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark and intelligent, and they held the unnerving stillness of a deep, calm pool of water. They saw everything. He did not look at her as property or as a trophy. He looked at her as a person, his gaze assessing, serious and surprisingly patient. He walked toward her, and the crowd parted for him in a wave of silent respect. He stopped a few feet from her horse. "You are Abigail Finch," he said. It was not a question. His voice was a low baritone, calm and measured, like DeSoto. He spoke English with a careful precision. "I am," she replied, her own voice sounding thin and reedy to her ears. "Your journey was long. You are weary." He gestured to Nantan. "Nantan will show you to the dwelling prepared for you. You will be given food and water. Rest. Tonight you will be welcomed by my people." He gave her a slight, formal nod, then turned and began speaking in low tones with the elders. The audience was over. It was a dismissal, but it was not unkind. It was practical. Abigail felt a strange mix of relief and anticlimax. This was the man her father had called a king, the man who held her future in his hands. And their first meeting had been as brief and functional as a transaction at the general store. Nantan led her horse toward one of the wickiups, a larger one set slightly apart from the others. Inside, it was surprisingly cool and spacious. Woven mats covered the earthen floor, and soft furs were piled neatly to one side for sleeping. A small fire pit in the center was cold, a trickle of sunlight filtering through the smoke hole in the roof. A young woman brought her a bowl of cool water to wash with and a gourd filled with a stew of beans, corn, and savory meat. Abigail ate, the simple food more satisfying than anything she had tasted in days. She was exhausted, her body aching from the long ride, her mind numb from the constant strain. She lay down on the soft furs, and despite the fear and uncertainty that churned within her, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She was awakened hours later by a gentle touch on her shoulder. An old woman with a face as beautifully wrinkled as a dried apple was kneeling beside her. Her eyes were bright and kind. Her long gray hair was neatly braided, and she wore a simple dress decorated with intricate beadwork. "The sun has gone to sleep," the woman said, her voice a soft, melodic rasp. "It is time. I am Yahatsi." "Yasi." The name felt warm and safe. Abigail sat up, feeling disoriented. The wickiup was now lit by the soft glow of a small oil lamp. Yatsi helped her to her feet and handed her a clean, simple buckskin dress. It was softer than any cloth she had ever felt. "Tyan and the elders await," Yahitsi explained as Abigail changed. "Do not be afraid. Just watch and listen. The heart learns faster than the head." Outside, the world had been transformed. The night sky was a vast blanket of brilliant, glittering stars, more than she had ever seen. The central fire was now a blazing beacon of light and warmth, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the people who were gathered in a wide circle around it. The rhythmic beat of a drum had begun, a steady, hypnotic pulse that seemed to resonate deep in her chest. Yaedzi led her to the circle and gestured for her to sit on a woven mat near the fire. She could feel the eyes of the community on her, but the darkness and the dancing flames gave her a sense of anonymity. Tyan was seated directly across the fire from her, flanked by the elders. In the firelight, his face looked even more severe, his features carved from shadow and flame. He watched her, his expression unreadable. The ceremony was one of quiet solemnity. An elder rose and spoke, his voice a low chant that rose and fell with the beat of the drum. He spoke of the land, of the spirits of the ancestors, of the sacredness of Silver Creek. He spoke of the new threat from the white men who did not honor the earth, and of the need for strength and unity. Then he spoke of the alliance, of the joining of two peoples through a new bond of kinship. As he spoke, he gestured toward Abigail, and then toward Tyan. Then Yahtzee gently prompted Abigail to stand. The old woman took a small clay bowl containing a mixture of corn pollen and water. With her finger, she drew a delicate line on the back of Abigail's right hand. Then she crossed the circle and did the same to Tyan. It was a simple gesture, a quiet marking, yet it felt as binding as any signed document. After the marking, people began to share food. Young women moved through the circle, offering baskets of roasted corn, strips of dried meat, and sweet berries. Abigail, unsure of the custom, hesitated. She felt a hard stare from a warrior sitting nearby, his face a mask of suspicion. Her cheeks grew hot with the fear of doing something wrong, of causing offense. Yasi, seeming to sense her discomfort, leaned close. "Take with your right hand," she whispered with a small, conspiratorial smile, "and always offer a word of thanks to the one who gives. A quiet heart is good, but a grateful one is better." Following the old woman's advice, Abigail shyly accepted a piece of cornbread, murmuring her thanks. The woman who offered it gave her a brief, hesitant smile in return. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. She was learning she could do this. Throughout the evening, she listened. She did not understand the words of the stories the elders told, but she understood the cadence, the reverence, the occasional bursts of communal laughter. She watched Tyan, He did not act like a king giving orders. He listened intently to the elders, his head slightly bowed in respect. He spoke quietly with the men who approached him, his hand resting on the shoulder of one, sharing a quiet joke with another. She saw him lift a small child who had toddled too close to the fire and return him to his mother with a gentle word. This was not a tyrant. This was a man carrying the concerns of every person in this circle. She began to understand what Nantan had meant. Power, for Tayan, was not a crown. It was a blanket he tried to stretch over all his people, to keep them safe and warm. Later, as the gathering began to wind down, Yahtzee began to tell her stories in a low voice. She spoke of Tayan's father, a great warrior who had been killed in a raid by Mexican soldiers. She told her how Tayan, then just a boy, had led the survivors back to the safety of the mesas. She spoke of a great drought, years ago, when Tayan had spent weeks searching the dry canyons until he found a hidden spring that had saved the community from thirst. He does not lead because he is the strongest or the loudest, Yahtzee said, her gaze fixed on the glowing embers of the fire. He leads because he carries us in here. She touched her chest, just above her heart. Every child that is hungry, every woman that is sick, every man that is worried. He feels it. That is his power, and his pain. Abigail looked across the dying fire at the man who was to be her husband. He was no longer just a fearsome Apache chief, a stranger from a hostile world. He was a man with a history, a man defined by his duty and his love for his people. The fear she had felt for him began to subtly shift, transforming into something more complex, something akin to a reluctant respect. She still feared her future, feared this alien world and her place in it. But she was beginning to believe that the man at the center of it was not a monster. And in that small, fragile realization, a tiny seed of trust, whether she wanted it to or not, had begun to take root. The days that followed the welcoming ceremony settled into a strange and quiet routine. Abigail was left mostly to herself, a ghost in a world that moved with rhythm she was only just beginning to perceive. Yahtzee was a gentle presence, showing her how to grind corn into fine meal, how to find the sweet, edible roots that grew near the hidden spring, and how to sew with a bone needle and sinew. Abigail was a clumsy student, her hands accustomed to different work, but she was a patient one. She learned that the Apache were a people of few wasted words and no wasted movements. Every action had a purpose. Every resource was honored. She kept her distance from Tayan, and he from her. She would see him from afar, consulting with the elders, instructing the young men in archery, or simply sitting alone on a high ledge, his silhouette a stark, lonely figure against the vast sky. He never approached her, yet she often felt his eyes on her, a brief, assessing gaze that was neither warm nor cold, but simply present. It was as if he were giving her time, letting her acclimate to the thin, dry air of his world at her own pace. The fear that had been her constant companion had receded, replaced by a quiet, watchful uncertainty. She was a boat adrift. Her old shoreline vanished, her new one still shrouded in fog. The first sign of the storm came not as a cloud, but as a change in the air. The relentless heat of the past week intensified, becoming a heavy, suffocating blanket. The sky, usually a brilliant, crystalline blue, took on a milky, yellowish haze. The birds fell silent. A strange, oppressive stillness settled over the mesa, a silence that felt louder and more ominous than any noise. The Apache people noticed it, too. Abigail saw them casting wary glances at the sky, securing the hides on their wickiups, and bringing their small herds of goats closer to the settlement. A nervous energy, a coiled anticipation, replaced the usual calm. It broke in the late afternoon. A low, menacing rumble echoed from the distant mountains, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. The wind came first, not as a breeze, but as a sudden, violent gusts that tore through the settlement, whipping up a blinding cloud of red dust. It shrieked through the canyons, a high, mournful sound like a chorus of grieving spirits. Abigail had taken shelter in her wickiup, and the structure, which had felt so sturdy and safe, now seemed as fragile as a basket of twigs. The wind clawed at the hides, and the wooden frame groaned in protest. Dust poured through the smoke hole and the seams, coating her throat and making her eyes water. Then came the rain. It was not the soft, life-giving rain she knew from Willow Bend. This was a hard, driving deluge, an assault from the heavens. The drops were as large as pebbles, striking the taut hides with a sound like 1,000 angry drums. Within minutes, the ground outside had turned into a churning river of red mud. A flash of lightning lit the wickiup's interior with a stark, terrifying brilliance, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the very ground she sat on. A primal, childish fear seized her. She was alone, in a flimsy shelter, at the mercy of a storm more savage than any she had ever known. She pulled a fur blanket around her shoulders, her body trembling, and squeezed her eyes shut. She thought of her small, sturdy room in Willow Bend, of the solid timber walls and the reassuring weight of a real roof over her head. She had never felt so small, so utterly helpless. Suddenly, the flap of the wickiup was thrown open, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought the wind had ripped it away, but a figure stood there, silhouetted against the gray. Raging storm. It was Tyan. Rain streamed from his unbound hair and down his face, but he seemed as unmoved by the tempest as a mountain pinnacle. "Come," he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "It is not safe here. We are going to the longhouse." He did not wait for an answer. He turned, expecting her to follow. Abigail scrambled to her feet, her fear of the storm momentarily eclipsed by her fear of being left behind. She stumbled out into the chaos. The wind and rain hit her with physical force, stealing her breath and plastering her clothes to her skin in an instant. The scene was one of controlled pandemonium. People were moving with a desperate urgency, their dark forms bent against the gale. But it was not a panic. There was a purpose to the movement. She saw Tyan shout an order to Nantan and another warrior, who immediately ran to help an old man whose wickiup was threatening to collapse. He then moved to a woman who was struggling to hold on to two small, crying children, scooping one of them up into his arms without breaking stride. He glanced back and saw Abigail frozen, her hands clutching her blanket, her face pale with terror. He strode back to her, his expression impatient but not angry. He took the small child from his own arms and pressed him into hers. The boy was no more than 4 years old, his small body trembling violently. "Hold him," Tyan commanded. "We must go, now." The simple, direct order jolted her out of her paralysis. The weight of the child in her arms, the feel of his small, cold hands clutching at her blouse, gave her a focus beyond her own fear. She followed Tyan, who now took the hand of the second child, leading them and the mother through the swirling mud and driving rain. He was the calm center of the storm, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling chaos. He seemed to be everywhere at once, directing, helping, protecting. He was not a king commanding from a throne. He was a leader wading through the flood with his people. The longhouse was a large, semi-subterranean structure built into the side of the mesa, its roof reinforced with heavy timbers and packed earth. Inside, it was crowded, noisy, and blessedly dry. Dozens of people were huddled together in the warm, lamp-lit space. The air was thick with the smell of wet buckskin, wood smoke, and damp earth. Children were crying, their fear amplified by the close quarters, while their mothers tried to soothe them with low, murmuring voices. Tyan saw them settled in a small, dry corner, then immediately moved back into the throng, his presence a calming influence. Abigail sat with the mother and her 2 sons, the little boy still clinging to her. She looked down at his tear-streaked face and felt a surge of empathy that momentarily washed away her own terror. She remembered the stories her own mother used to tell her during thunderstorms, simple tales of brave rabbits and clever coyotes. Hesitantly, she began to whisper one of the stories into the boy's ear, her voice barely audible above the din. She spoke of a little jackrabbit who was afraid of the loud noises in the sky, and how his mother told him it was just the sky spirits moving their furniture around. The boy's sobs slowly subsided, and he listened, his dark eyes wide and fixed on her face. A few other children, drawn by the sound of her voice, crept closer to listen. Before she knew it, she was surrounded by a small, silent circle of them, their fear held at bay by the simple magic of a story. She did not notice Yahtzee watching from across the longhouse, a slow, knowing smile on her face. She did not notice Tayan pause in his duties to watch her for a long moment, a new, unreadable expression in his eyes. She was no longer Abigail Finch, the captive bride. She was simply a young woman comforting frightened children, her act of quiet courage as natural and unthinking as breathing. The storm raged for another hour, then passed as quickly as it had arrived. The wind died down to a mournful sigh, and the drumming of the rain softened to a gentle patter. A collective sigh of relief went through the longhouse. People began to stir, to speak in normal voices, to assess the damage to their world. Abigail returned the little boy to his grateful mother and found herself standing awkwardly alone. She had done something useful, something good, and the feeling was a small, warm coal in the cold expanse of her uncertainty. You have a gift with children. She turned. Tayan was standing behind her. He had a clay cup in his hand, which he offered to her. It was filled with a warm, minty tea. They were frightened, she said, accepting the cup. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt a surprising warmth, a jolt of simple human contact that startled her. We were all frightened, he said, his gaze direct. Only a fool would not respect a storm like that. It is the voice of a power greater than any man. He gestured to a spot near the central fire pit, where the flames were now being built up again. Sit, the night is not over. They sat in a comfortable silence for a long time, watching the flames, listening to the murmur of voices around them. The dramatic tension of the storm had given way to a quiet, shared sense of relief. I have never seen rain like that, she said finally, her voice soft. Our rains are not like the gentle rains of the river valley, he replied. Here, the sky gives its gifts with a violent hand, but without the storm, our cisterns would be empty and the corn would wither. There is life in the violence. She thought of the slaughtered buffalo, of the surveyors with their map, of her father's desperate bargain. It seems there is violence in everything out here. He looked at her, his expression serious. There is, but there is also a choice. The storm does not choose to destroy. It brings the water we need to live. The hunter who kills one deer to feed his family is not the same as the man who kills 100 buffalo for their skins. One is an act of life. The other is an act of greed. He paused, his gaze seeming to look right through her. Your father understands this. He made a hard choice, a violent choice in its way, but he chose life. Hearing him speak of her father with understanding, without judgment, cracked something open inside her. The last wall of her resentment, the feeling of being a betrayed and bartered object, began to crumble. I was so angry with him, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper, and so afraid of you. Fear is a wise guide, he said, echoing Nantan's words from the trail. But it should not be your home. You do not belong to fear. Abigail, you belong to the Chiricahua now. You are one of us, and we protect our own. As he spoke, he reached out, his movements slow and deliberate. He did not try to embrace her or caress her. He simply took her hand, the one that was not holding the cup, and held it in his. His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a warrior and a leader, but his grip was gentle. It was not the possessive grip of a master, but the steady, reassuring clasp of a protector, a partner. She looked down at their joined hands, at his dark, strong fingers covering her paler, trembling ones. The warmth from his hand spread up her arm and into her chest, a slow, melting tide that seemed to push back the last of the cold fear that had taken root in her heart so long ago. The storm outside was over, and for the first time, she felt that perhaps, just perhaps, the storm inside her might be ending. Too, she was not alone, and in this wild, terrifying land, that was everything. The fragile peace that had settled over Red Mesa after the storm lasted less than a fortnight. It was broken by the arrival of a scout, his pony lathered and exhausted, who brought news that traveled through the community like a cold wind. Owen Mallory had returned to Willow Bend, and he had not come alone. He had brought with him a company of 20 men, a hired army that called themselves the Black Spur. They were not prospectors or cowboys. They were men with hard eyes and rifles, and they made their camp just upriver from the town. A clear and deliberate provocation. The news landed like a stone in the calm pool of Abigail's new existence. The whispers of silver had become a roar. In the council of elders, the mood was grim. The younger warriors, led by the same man who had glared at her during the welcoming ceremony, spoke of a preemptive strike, of meeting violence with violence. But Tyan listened in his characteristic stillness, his face impassive, letting the heated words wash over him. When the council was over, he sought out Abigail. She was sitting with Yagzi mending a child's torn moccasin, the simple domestic act a stark contrast to the war talk that hung in the air. They do not yet know the location of the main silver vein, Tyan said, his voice low. They are probing, testing our strength, trying to frighten the townspeople into siding with them. They will succeed, Abigail said, her needle pausing. Mallory is a good talker. He will promise them riches, a future Willow Bend has only ever dreamed of. He will paint your people as the only thing standing in the way. Tyan nodded slowly, his dark eyes fixed on her. Your people will not listen to me, or to Nantan, but they might listen to you. You are Thomas Finch's daughter. You are one of them. And now, he added, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze, you are one of us. You are the bridge between our two worlds. Abigail, it is a heavy burden, but it is also your strength. She understood what he was asking before he said the words. You want me to go back? I want you to speak the truth, he corrected gently. To remind them of the peace we have shared. To remind them that Mallory's promises are soaked in the blood of the men who will die if he gets his way. Propose a meeting, a formal council. We must try the path of words before we walk the path of arrows and bullets. A week ago, the thought of returning to Willow Bend would have filled her with a desperate, hopeful longing. Now, it filled her with dread. She was no longer the girl who had left that town. She had seen the slaughtered buffalo, the surveyor's map, the quiet strength of this community. Going back felt like a retreat, a step backward into a world that no longer fit. But she saw the wisdom in Tyan's request. She was the only one who could do it. I will go, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. But I will not go alone. Nantan will go with you, Tyan said, having already anticipated her condition. He will be your guard and my eyes and ears. The return journey was faster, fueled by a grim urgency. When they rode down the main street of Willow Bend, the changes were immediately apparent. The town's atmosphere was thick with a nervous, gold rush energy. There were new faces in the street, rough-looking men from the Black Spur camp who watched her and Nantan with open hostility. The door to the saloon swung open and shut, spilling loud talk and the tinny sound of a poorly played piano into the dusty air. Her reunion with her family was a maelstrom of emotions. Her mother wept and held her, overjoyed to see her safe, yet terrified by the Apache warrior who stood like a silent, bronze statue at her side. Her father looked older, his face etched with worry. But the biggest shock was her younger brother, Caleb. He was 16, with a boy's lanky frame and a face that was still deciding what it would become. He had always been quiet and eager to please, and now he wore a new set of clothes and a look of strained importance. "Caleb has a job," her mother announced with a fragile pride. "He is working as a clerk for Agent Whitlock." Abigail looked from her brother's nervous, shifting eyes to her father's grim face and felt a cold premonition. Caleb, working for the one man who was at the heart of this entire treacherous scheme. She tried to catch her brother's eye, but he avoided her gaze, busying himself with fetching her a glass of water. That evening, Owen Mallory held court in Widow May's saloon. Abigail, against her father's wishes but with Nantan shadowing her from across the street, went to listen. Mallory was a master performer. He was handsome in a polished, Eastern way, dressed in a fine suit that seemed absurdly out of place in the dusty frontier town. He stood on a crate, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and sold a beautiful, poisonous dream. "I see a new future for Willow Bend," he proclaimed, his voice ringing with manufactured sincerity. "A future of prosperity, with a school for your children, a real doctor, a railroad line that will connect you to the rest of this great nation. The earth beneath our feet is rich, my friends. All that is required is the courage to take it." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But there are those who would stand in the way of progress, those who cling to the past, who would rather see this land remain a barren wasteland than share in God's bounty. I am speaking, of course, of the Apache." A low murmur went through the crowd. He was fanning the embers of old fears and prejudices. Agent Whitlock stood beside him, nodding sagely, lending the proceedings a false air of government approval. "Mr. Mallory is a federally sanctioned developer," Whitlock added, his voice thin and reedy. "His work to civilize this territory has the full backing of the Department of the Interior." "I do not want conflict," Mallory continued, his tone softening to one of feigned reason. "But we cannot allow superstition and savagery to halt the march of American enterprise." It was then that Abigail spoke, her voice clear and steady in the suddenly silent saloon. "The Apache do not cling to the past. Mr. Mallory, they honor it. There is a treaty. This land you speak of is their sacred ground." Every head turned toward her. Mallory's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before he recovered his composure. "Ah, Miss Finch, or should I say, Mrs. Tyan, we hear you have been adopted by our neighbors. Tell me, do they speak of progress around their campfires or only of war?" "They speak of peace," Abigail countered, stepping forward. "The peace you are threatening to destroy. Tyan, my husband, is a man of honor. He proposes a meeting, a formal council, to discuss this matter peacefully. Here, in the telegraph office, where a message can be sent to the territorial governor to mediate this dispute according to the law." She had thrown down a gauntlet. To refuse a peaceful meeting in front of the whole town would expose him as a warmonger. A low rumble of approval came from some of the older residents, men like Mr. Henderson from the ferry, who valued stability over risky promises. Mallory was trapped. He gave a gracious, oily smile. "An admirable suggestion. A council it is. Let us meet tomorrow at noon. We are all reasonable men here." The next day, the small post and telegraph office was crowded and suffocatingly hot. Abigail stood with her father and Nantan. Mallory arrived with Whitlock and two of his largest Black Spur mercenaries, who stood by the door, their hands resting on their pistols. The telegraph operator, a nervous man named Silas, whom Mallory had recently hired, sat at his key, avoiding everyone's eyes. The meeting was a farce from the start. Mallory and Whitlock produced a stack of official-looking documents, claiming the old treaty boundaries were invalid due to a new geological survey. "This is a lie," Thomas Finch said, his voice trembling with rage. "These surveys are fraudulent." "According to Agent Whitlock, they are perfectly legal," Mallory said smoothly. "Now, about this telegram you wish to send. What would it say?" Abigail spoke. It would request an impartial federal mediator to examine the treaty, and Mr. Mallory's claim to the resources in Silver Creek Canyon. Whitlock scoffed. A waste of time and government expense. The matter is already settled. Then you should have no objection to sending the message, Nantan said, his voice a low growl. It was the first time he had spoken, and the sound of it made everyone flinch. Mallory gestured to the operator. Silas, please send the young lady's message. Silas tapped at his key for a moment, then stopped, a look of frustration on his face. I'm sorry, ma'am. The line is down. Some trouble up near the pass. Could be days before it is fixed. Abigail stared at him, then at Mallory's smug face. It was a lie. A calculated, perfect lie. They were cut off, trapped. The final, devastating blow came later that evening. Abigail had tried to speak to Caleb, to ask him what he knew about Whitlock's business, but her brother was pale and evasive, claiming he was just a clerk and knew nothing. Frustrated, she had gone for a walk, needing to clear her head. Nantan, ever watchful, followed at a discreet distance. As she passed the alley behind the saloon, she heard the loud, drunken boasting of one of the Black Spur men. He was talking to a friend, his words slurring together. Showed it to me himself. Mallory did, a real beauty. The man fumbled in his coat and pulled out a folded, oilskin-wrapped paper. He unrolled it on a barrel top, and in the dim light from the saloon window, Abigail saw it. It was a map, not the crude surveyor's sketch she had seen from the ridge, but a detailed, professional drawing. It showed the canyons, the ridges, and a thick, unmistakable blue line that snaked its way directly through the heart of the area the Apache called Silver Creek. It was marked with geological notes and calculations. This was not a map of exploration. It was a map of extraction. It was the blueprint for the rape of the land. The mercenary laughed. A ugly, grating sound, right through their sacred dancing ground. He is going to dig his mine right where they pray. That'll teach the heathens about progress. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. She backed away into the shadows, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a gasp. She turned and nearly collided with Nantan, whose face was a mask of cold, deadly fury. He had seen it too. They now had the final, absolute proof of Mallory's intentions. It was not just about silver. It was about utter, crushing desecration. It was an act of war designed not just to take the land, but to break the spirit of its people. There would be no more talk of mediation. The telegraph line was a lie, the council a sham, the law a tool in the hands of greedy men. The smoke from Mallory's ambition was no longer a distant haze. It was a black, choking cloud, and it was about to consume them all. They returned to Red Mesa under the cold light of a rising moon. The damning knowledge of the map a heavy, unspoken weight between them. When Nantan presented the drawing he had made, a faithful copy of the mercenary's map, to the elders, a grim and stony silence fell over the council fire. The time for words, for hope in treaties and mediators, was over. Mallory's intent was clear. An open declaration of war not just on their land, but on their spirit. The younger warriors spoke again of battle, their voices now hard with certainty. And this time, the elders did not counsel patience. Preparations began at once. Scouts were sent to watch Mallory's movements. Weapons were checked and rechecked, and a quiet, focused determination settled over the community. The air was thick with the coming storm. In this heavy atmosphere, Abigail felt like a ghost, caught between the life she had lost and the war she had inadvertently brought to this new one. She watched the women gathering extra food and water, the men sharpening arrowheads and cleaning rifles, and a profound sense of helplessness washed over her. She was the reason for this fragile alliance, yet she felt she had no role to play in its defense. It was Yazi who broke through her solitude. The old woman came to her on the third night after her return, a night when the moon was a perfect, luminous disk in the black sky. so bright it bleached the color from the red rocks and cast sharp, dark shadows. "Tonight is the dance of the wolf moon," Yazi said, her voice soft. "It is the time we honor the changing of the seasons, the resilience of our people, and the promises of the hunt to come. It is a time to remember that we are alive, even when death walks the borders of our land. You will come." It was not a request. Abigail followed the old woman to the central clearing, where a great fire had been built, its flames leaping high into the night, sending sparks spiraling up to meet the stars. The entire community was there, their faces painted with simple, symbolic lines of white clay, their expressions somber yet resolute. The air was fragrant with the scent of burning sage and juniper, a clean, sharp smell that cut through the chill of the high desert night. The drums began, a slow, deep, resonant heartbeat that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. It was the pulse of the mesa, the pulse of the people. The dancers formed a large circle, moving with a shuffling, rhythmic step, their bodies swaying in unison. It was not a dance of celebration, but one of prayer and remembrance, a solemn affirmation of their connection to the land and to each other. Abigail watched from the shadows, feeling like an intruder. This was a deep, sacred part of their world, and she did not belong. She was a stranger, a white woman, the cause of their current peril. But as she watched, she saw no anger in their faces, only a profound, shared sense of purpose. She saw Tyan dancing among the men, his movements as fluid and controlled as the rest of his being, his face a mask of intense concentration. He was not their king tonight, he was simply one of them, his feet tracing the same ancient steps as his father's before him. She was about to slip away, back to the solitude of her wickiup, when the circle of dancers broke. The first part of the ceremony was over. In the quiet that followed, Tyan walked directly toward her. He stopped before her, the firelight flickering in his dark, serious eyes. The whole community watched in a sudden, expectant silence. "The dance is not over," he said, his voice low and clear. He held out his hand. "Dance with me." Her breath caught in her throat. It was a public invitation, a statement more powerful than any words. It was an act of inclusion, of claiming her before all his people. To refuse would be an insult not just to him, but to the spirit of the gathering. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was a clumsy dancer, a girl of boardwalks and church socials. She would shame him. But then she looked at his outstretched hand, and in his steady gaze, she saw no command, only an offering of trust. Taking a shaky breath, she placed her hand in his fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. He led her into the circle as the drums began again, the beat slightly faster now. "Do not think with your head," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. "Listen to the drum. Let your feet feel the earth. It will tell you what to do." His hand was a firm, guiding presence on her back. She stumbled at first, her steps awkward and out of rhythm, her face burning with embarrassment. A few of the younger warriors exchanged smirks. "You dance like a newborn foal," Tyan said, and she was stunned to hear the faint trace of amusement in his voice. It was the first time she had ever heard him come close to making a joke. "A foal learns," she retorted, a spark of her old defiance returning. "Yes," he agreed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips in the firelight. "It does." She closed her eyes for a moment, shutting out the watching faces, and did as he said. She focused on the steady, insistent beat of the drum, on the feel of the packed earth beneath the thin soles of her moccasins, on the solid presence of the man beside her. Slowly, hesitantly, her body began to understand. Her steps found the rhythm. She was no longer fighting the dance. She was joining it. When she opened her eyes, she was moving with the circle, one part of a larger whole. They danced in silence for a long time. their hands linked, their bodies moving in the ancient, hypnotic pattern, in the shared rhythm, in the sacred space of the circle. The distance between them seemed to dissolve. He was no longer the Apache chief, and she was no longer the white bride. They were simply a man and a woman, moving as one under the light of the wolf moon. When the drums finally fell silent, he did not release her hand. He led her away from the fire, away from the dispersing crowd, to the edge of the mesa. Below them, the vast, moon-drenched landscape stretched out into a silver infinity. They stood for a long time. The only sounds the sigh of the wind through the junipers and the distant echo of a coyote's cry. "My father died on a night like this," Tyan said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it. He was not looking at her, but out at the silent, sleeping land. He was leading a hunting party. They were ambushed. I was just a boy, but I was there. I saw it. He spoke of it plainly, without self-pity, as a simple, terrible fact of his life. I made a promise that night over his body. I promised I would never again let my people be caught unprepared. I promised I would protect them, that I would be the rock that the wind and the rain could not move. It is a promise I have kept. He turned to look at her then, his eyes dark with the weight of memory and responsibility. This alliance, this marriage, it was part of that promise, a way to protect my people without bloodshed. At first, that is all it was, a strategy, a move in a game to protect this land. Abigail's heart ached for the boy he had been, and for the man that boy had been forced to become. "And me?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "Was I just a part of the strategy? A piece in the game?" "You were," he admitted, his honesty as sharp and clean as a shard of flint. "But you are not a game piece, Abigail. You are a person. You have courage. I saw it in the storm, with the children. I saw it when you stood up to Mallory in the saloon. You have a leader's heart, even if you do not know it." He paused, his gaze softening. "The promise I made was to my people, but I find now that I have made a new one. A promise to you. I will protect you. Not as a part of a treaty, but as my wife." The sincerity in his voice was a raw, undeniable force. It stripped away the last of her defenses, the last vestiges of her anger at her father, at her fate. In that moment, she was not a sacrifice. She was a choice, and she realized that she had a choice to make, too. "I was so afraid," she confessed, the words pouring out of her. "When I first came here, all I could feel was fear, fear of you, of your people, of this land. It was a cold, hard thing, like a stone in my stomach. I thought it would never go away." She looked up at him, at his weathered, serious face illuminated by the moonlight, and she spoke a truth that was so new, so fragile. It felt like a butterfly testing its wings. "It is not gone," she said. "The fear is still there, but it is different now. It is fear for this place, for these people, for you." She took a breath, her hand tightening on his. "I choose to be here, Tyan, not because of my father or because of a treaty. I choose it." He looked down at their joined hands, and then back up at her face, and he saw the truth of her words in her eyes. He saw the strength that had been forged in her fear. A slow, profound understanding passed between them, an intimacy that went deeper than words, deeper than any touch. It was a meeting of two lonely souls who had found an unexpected sanctuary in each other. It was the quiet, certain dawn of a new and profound connection. At just 18, the Virgin became the Apache King's bride, and fear slowly bloomed into love. He raised her hand to his lips and brushed a gentle kiss across her knuckles. It was a gesture of such profound and unexpected tenderness that it made her entire body ache with an emotion she could not name. It was not the passion of a lover, but the reverence of a man who had found something precious he had never expected to find. They stood together on the edge of their world, two people from different rivers, now bound by a shared heart, watching the moon begin its slow descent toward a horizon that promised war. But for the first time, Abigail did not face it with terror. She faced it with him. The quiet intimacy of the wolf moon dance felt like a dream from another lifetime. In the days that followed, the reality of their situation descended upon Red Mesa like a hawk's shadow. Every man, woman, and child had a role in the preparations for a war they all prayed would not come. The mood was not one of panic, but of a grim, focused resolve that was far more unnerving. It was the calm of a people who had known war for generations, who understood its terrible price and accepted its necessity. Tyan, despite the evidence of the map and Mallory's open aggression, was a man carved from patience. He held the reins of his warrior's anger with a firm, steady hand. He knew Mallory was laying a trap, and to charge into it blindly would be a fatal mistake. Against the counsel of his more heated advisors, he decided to make one final, desperate gesture toward the peace his marriage to Abigail was supposed to represent. He chose 3 men, led by the stern, silent warrior Howe, to act as messengers. They were not to ride into Willowbend, which was now filled with Mallory's hired guns. They were to ride under a flag of truce to a neutral point in the canyons, a place designated in the original treaty for formal communication, and deliver a message directly to Thomas Finch. The message was simple. Tyan would not be provoked into attacking the town, but any incursion by the Black Spur mercenaries into the sacred lands of Silver Creek would be met as an act of war. It was a clear line drawn in the sand. They left at dawn. Abigail watched them go, a small knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She stood beside Tyan, who watched until the riders were just small specks disappearing into the vast, red landscape. He said nothing, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, the immense strain of a leader weighing the lives of his people against a fragile hope. The hope was shattered 2 days later. A single rider returned. It was not Howe. It was the youngest of the messengers, a boy of no more than 18, and he was clinging to the neck of his pony, a dark, ugly stain spreading across his buckskin shirt. He collapsed into the arms of the men who rushed to help him and, with a voice ragged with pain and grief, told his story. They had been ambushed. As they approached the designated meeting place, a volley of rifle fire had erupted from the rocks above. Howe and the other warrior had been cut down instantly. The boy had been hit, but his horse, in a panic, had bolted and carried him to safety. It was not a battle. He gasped. It was a massacre, and as he lay bleeding, hidden in a thicket of scrub oak, he had seen them, the Black Spur men, and leading them, pointing out the path, was a young white man from the town, a boy with fair hair, a boy who knew the trails. The description hung in the air, a poisonous vapor. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face as every eye in the stunned crowd slowly turned to her. A boy with fair hair, her brother, Caleb. The news spread through the settlement like a grass fire. The flimsy evidence of the ambush was cemented when a patrol of warriors, sent to investigate, returned with a single, damning object, one of Howe's arrows, found embedded in the trunk of a cottonwood tree near the body of a Black Spur mercenary. It was a lie, a carefully planted piece of theater. The Apache had not been the ambushed. They had been the attackers. Tyan had broken the treaty. That night, the council fire burned with a furious, hungry light. The faction of warriors who had long called for war now had their proof, their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Taza, whose family had been killed in a skirmish with soldiers years before, stood and pointed a trembling finger at Abigail. "We took this woman in. We honored her, and her people repay us with treachery. Her own brother leads our enemies to slaughter our messengers under a flag of peace. There are no more words to be spoken. We must ride to this willow bend. We must burn their town and salt the earth so that nothing of them remains." A roar of approval went up from many of the warriors. They were ready. They were eager. Their grief had curdled into a righteous rage. Abigail stood on the edge of the circle, feeling the heat of their hatred like a physical blow. She wanted to scream that it was a lie, that her brother could not do such a thing. But the wounded messenger's description was a knife twisting in her gut. She thought of Caleb's averted eyes, his nervous energy, his ill-fitting new job with Agent Whitlock. It was impossible, yet horribly, terrifyingly possible. It was Tyan who quelled the firestorm. He rose to his feet, his face as hard and immovable as the mesa itself. He let the angry shouts wash over him until a tense, expectant silence fell. "You speak with the fire of grief, Taza," he said, his voice low and controlled. "Yet it carried to every corner of the circle. And your anger is just, how was my friend? He was a brother to us all. But we will not honor his memory by walking into a fool's trap." He swept his gaze over the angry faces of his warriors. "Think. Mallory has been trying to provoke us from the day he arrived. He wants us to attack the town. He wants the people of Willow Bend to see us as savages. He wants the army to come. An attack on the town is not a victory. It is a death sentence for our people. This ambush." He spat the word as if it were poison. "It is too perfect. The evidence is too easy. It is the work of a man who wants to be found out, but only in the way that benefits him. It is the work of a snake." "And the white boy the traitor Taza demanded." Tyan's gaze flickered to Abigail for a fraction of a second. And in that moment, she saw not accusation, but a shared burden. "We do not know the whole truth of that yet," he said. "I will not lead my people into a war based on the word of a wounded boy and a single, convenient arrow. I must have proof, undeniable proof of who is pulling the snake's strings." His words, spoken with such unshakable authority, calmed the immediate furor, but the settlement remained a tinderbox, ready to explode at the slightest spark. The peace was broken. The treaty was a ghost. Abigail fled the council, her heart a tangled knot of fear, loyalty, and a sickening dread. She was torn in two. Her mind screamed that Caleb was innocent, a gentle boy who could not possibly be involved in such a cold-blooded murder. But her heart remembered the surveyors, the map, the cold ambition in Mallory's eyes, and the web of deceit spun by Whitlock. Caleb was not evil, but he was young, perhaps in debt, perhaps easily manipulated. A pawn, just as she had been. She found Nantan by the horse corral, his face grim in the moonlight. "It is a lie," she whispered, needing to say the words aloud, to convince herself. "The boy who survived is not a liar," Nantan replied quietly, but perhaps he did not see all there was to see. "What do you mean?" "A man can be forced to hold a gun. That does not make him a killer. It makes him a captive." His words offered a sliver of hope, a different way to see the terrible picture. Caleb was not a traitor. He was a prisoner. And suddenly, Abigail knew what she had to do. The truth was not in Red Mesa. The truth was locked away in that small, stuffy telegraph office in Willow Bend. She found Tyan standing on the same ledge where they had stood on the night of the Wolf Moon dance. She walked up to him, her resolve hardening with every step. "It was Whitlock," she said, her voice firm. "He is controlling Caleb somehow, and he is controlling the flow of information. I do not believe the telegraph line was ever broken. I believe Mallory's man, Silas, lied to us. There must be a record, a logbook, something to prove it." Tyan looked at her, his face a mask in the darkness. "You want to go back there? Into the snake's den?" "It is the only way," she insisted. "You need undeniable proof. The telegraph logbook is that proof. It is a federal record. Mallory can hire guns and bribe agents, but he cannot erase a logbook without committing a federal crime. It is the one thing that can expose him and Whitlock for what they are." "It is too dangerous. The town is a powder keg. Mallory's men are everywhere." "Nantan and I have done it before. We can do it again," she said, her voice pleading now. "This is not just about your people anymore. It is about my people, too. The people of Willow Bend are being lied to, manipulated into a war they do not want. My brother is trapped in the middle of it. I cannot stand here and do nothing. Please let me do this." He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the distant, sleeping town that was now a beacon of danger. He was a leader, and his every instinct screamed to protect his people, to protect her. But he was also a strategist, and he saw the desperate, brilliant logic of her plan. It was a wild gamble, a single arrow shot in the dark, but it was their only chance. "Nantan will go with you," he said finally, his voice heavy. "Travel only by night. Trust no one. Get the book and come back. Do not be a hero, Abigail. Be a survivor." The journey back was a tense, hurried flight through a landscape that had become enemy territory. They rode through the darkness, their horses' hooves muffled on the sandy ground, their conversation reduced to whispers. "It is becoming a bad habit, sneaking into my own town," Abigail murmured as they lay on a ridge overlooking the now silent main street of Willow Bend. Nantan, who was scanning the rooftops for sentries, allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Perhaps you will find you prefer a life of crime. It is more exciting than mending moccasins." "I think I will stick to mending," she whispered back. "It is less likely to get you shot." They crept into the town like shadows, using the alleys and dark spaces between buildings. The post office was dark, but a single black spur mercenary sat in a chair tilted against the wall outside, a rifle across his lap, half asleep. Nantan moved with a silence that was utterly inhuman. One moment he was beside her, the next he was behind the guard, the hilt of his knife striking the man's temple with a sickening, soft thud. The guard slumped in his chair, unconscious. While Nantan dragged the man into the alley, Abigail slipped the lock on the office door with a piece of wire she had brought. Inside, the office smelled of stale ink and ozone. Her hands trembled as she lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low. She found the logbook on Silas's desk. It was a thick, leather-bound volume. With her heart pounding, she opened it to the date of their failed council. And there it was, the truth. Not in a single entry, but in a damning series of them. Her finger traced the elegant, spidery script. She saw an entry for a message sent by Whitlock to the nearest army fort, reporting fabricated Apache raids and requesting military intervention. Then, a reply from a Colonel Stanhope, ordering Whitlock to avoid conflict and await the arrival of a federal marshal. Whitlock had lied. He had no authority to act. Then she saw the final, crushing piece of evidence. An incoming message from Santa Fe, from the office of the territorial governor himself. It was addressed to her father. It confirmed the receipt of an earlier, frantic wire Thomas Finch must have sent before the line was cut. The governor's message stated he was aware of the land dispute, was dispatching a federal judge, a man named Gaines, and a journalist to investigate, and ordered all parties to stand down. Silas had marked the message, line failure, message undeliverable. Abigail sank into the operator's chair, the heavy book open in her lap. The breath left her body in a shuddering gasp. It was all here, the lies, the conspiracy, the manufactured war. Whitlock had not just been a passive accomplice. He was an active traitor, faking federal orders and deliberately isolating Willow Bend to give Mallory a free hand. She was holding the truth, a truth written in ink that was more powerful than any bullet. And as she stared at the page, she realized the terrible, crushing weight of what she had to do next. It was no longer enough to bring this book back to Red Mesa. She had to get this truth to the rest of the world before the killing started. The ride back to Red Mesa was a desperate, moon-drenched race against the dawn, with the stolen logbook wrapped in oilskin and tucked securely in his saddlebag. Nantan set a relentless pace, his face grim and set. Every rustle of a bush, every cry of a night bird, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Abigail. They had not just stolen a book, they had lit the fuse on a powder keg, and they could hear the hiss of it shortening with every mile they covered. They rode not with the cautious stealth of their journey in, but with the frantic urgency of messengers carrying news of a king's death. They arrived in the gray, pre-dawn light, their horses heaving and slick with sweat. The settlement was already stirring, the Apache people early risers by nature, but their quiet morning routines were shattered by the sight of Abigail and Nantan's frantic arrival. Tyan met them at the edge of the central clearing, his face a mask of concern that deepened into a hard, cold fury, as Abigail, her voice ragged and breathless, explained what she had found in the logbook. The proof was absolute, a web of lies and federal crimes so blatant it was breathtaking. But any satisfaction they might have felt was brutally short-lived. Even as Tyan examined the damning entries, a scout appeared on the high ridge overlooking the settlement, his silhouette stark against the brightening sky. He raised his arm, signaling 3 times in a prearranged code. Riders approaching. Many riders. And they were moving fast. The time for deliberation was over. Tyan became a figure of pure, focused energy. His commands were sharp, clear, and instantly obeyed. The women, children, and elders were to gather in the communal longhouse, the semi-subterranean structure that had sheltered them from the storm. It was their most defensible position. Warriors, their faces already hardening into the impassive masks of battle, fanned out, taking up positions among the rocks and crevices of the mesa, a landscape they knew as well as their own hands. They were not preparing an attack. They were creating a fortress, a deadly maze of interlocking fields of fire for anyone foolish enough to try and assault them. In the midst of this controlled chaos, Abigail felt a surge of desperate clarity. The logbook was their salvation, but it was useless if it was buried here with their bodies. She grabbed Tyan's arm, her eyes wild with a sudden, improbable idea. "The wire," she said, her words tumbling out. "Nantan told me about an old telegraph wire the army surveyors left behind years ago, the one that runs along the high cliff face. Is it still there?" Tyan looked at her, his mind clearly on the deployment of his men. But he understood instantly. "It is broken, and we have no key." "I have a key," she said, pulling the spare operator's key she had taken from the office from her satchel. "And we do not need the whole line, just enough to get a signal out. If we can connect it, if we can find a clean break, we can send the message. We can call for the judge." It was a sliver of a chance, a madman's hope, but it was the only one they had. Tyan looked at her, a profound, raw respect in his eyes. He clapped Nantan on the shoulder. "Go with her. Keep her safe. You are her shield." As Nantan and Abigail scrambled up the narrow, treacherous path toward the high cliffs, the first of Mallory's forces appeared at the mouth of the canyon. It was a motley army. At its core were the 20 disciplined Black Spur mercenaries, moving with professional efficiency. But behind them was a disorganized mob of about 30 men from Willow Bend, their faces a mixture of greed, fear, and misplaced anger, whipped into a frenzy by Mallory's promises and lies about the Apache ambush. Owen Mallory rode at their head, resplendent in his fine Eastern suit, looking utterly out of place and dangerously confident. Beside him, looking pale and nervous, was Agent Whitlock from a high ledge. Mallory cupped his hands around his mouth. "Tyan," he shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You are trespassing on land designated for development by the United States government. Lay down your weapons and surrender your fugitives. Do this, and you will be treated fairly." Tyan appeared on a ledge far above him, a solitary, defiant figure. "This is the land of my people," his voice boomed back, calm and powerful. "You are the trespasser, Mallory. You come with lies and murderers. Leave now, and there will be no bloodshed." As if in answer, the world began to change. The wind, which had been a gentle morning breeze, suddenly picked up, whining through the rocks. On the western horizon, the clear blue sky was being devoured by a rising, ominous wall of yellow-brown dust, a sandstorm. It was coming. A third army invited to the battle by the land itself. The first shot was fired from the ranks of the town militia, a nervous man whose fear got the better of him. The bullet whined harmlessly off a rock far from Tyan, but it was the spark the tinderbox needed. The Black Spur mercenaries opened fire, a disciplined volley that sent chips of red rock flying from the Apache positions. The battle for Red Mesa had begun. Just as the first volley was fired, the sandstorm hit. It descended upon the canyon not as rain, but as a suffocating, blinding curtain of grit and wind. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. The roar of the wind drowned out all other sounds, turning the battlefield into a chaotic, terrifying swirl of brown haze and confusion. For Mallory's men, it was a disaster. They were blind, lost in a landscape they did not know, their neat battle lines dissolving into scattered, frightened groups. For the Apache, it was a gift. They knew every rock, every path, every hiding place. They became ghosts in the storm, firing a single and deadly arrow and melting back into the swirling dust before a shot could be returned. High above the chaotic battle, Abigail and Nantan fought their own desperate war. They found the old wire, a single strand of rusted iron clinging to the cliff face. It was snapped, the two ends dangling 20 feet apart, while Nantan, with the agility of a mountain goat, secured a new length of wire to bridge the gap. Abigail worked on the key, her fingers numb with cold and fear, the wind threatening to tear her from her precarious perch. Mallory would have been smarter to check the weather forecast. Nantan grunted, his voice a dry rasp as he pulled the wire taut. He was too busy counting his silver to look at the sky. Abigail shouted back over the roar of the wind. She connected the wires to the key, her heart pounding. Would it work? She began to tap, sending out a simple test signal, listening for the faint click of a complete circuit. Nothing. Frantically, she checked the connections again. Then she saw it, a small break in the old wire's insulation, causing it to ground against the rock. With a piece of oilskin from her satchel, she rapped the break, her hands shaking so badly she could barely tie the knot. She tried again. Click, click, click. The circuit was live. Tears of relief and terror streamed down her face. Instantly turning to mud, she began to tap out her message, the dots and dashes a frantic prayer sent into the storm. Judge Gaines, Santa Fe, Owen Mallory, attacking Red Mesa. Agent Whitlock complicit. Have proof in telegraph logbook. Federal crimes. Massacre imminent. Intervention urgent. She repeated the message over and over, a desperate mantra, praying that somewhere, miles away, someone was listening. Below, the battle was turning into a rout, but Mallory, in a fit of rage and desperation, would not retreat. He knew from his map that the entrance to the mine, the very heart of his ambition, lay at the base of a sacred needle-like spire of rock that was the centerpiece of the mesa, blinded by the storm, blinded by greed. He rallied a small group of his best mercenaries. The spire, he screamed over the wind, "Take the spire and we break them." He led the charge himself, a mad, suicidal rush into the blinding dust toward a landmark he could barely see. It was this charge that brought him past the shallow cave where Abigail's brother Caleb was huddled with Agent Whitlock and a few of the terrified townsmen. Caleb had been brought along as a guide, a human shield, a guarantee of his silence. In the swirling chaos, a ricocheting bullet struck the rock face above them, sending a shower of stone fragments cascading down. Caleb froze, his face a mask of pure terror, directly in the path of the small avalanche. Abigail, descending from her post after sending her message one last time, saw the danger, without a thought for her own safety. She lunged, tackling her brother and knocking him back into the relative safety of the cave just as the rocks crashed down where he had been standing. He stared at her, his eyes wide with shock and a dawning, horrified understanding of the reality of his situation. The sight of his leverage being saved by his enemy seemed to unhinge Agent Whitlock. His face, already pale, turned a pasty white. His carefully constructed world was literally crumbling around him. The attack was failing. The Apache were ghosts, and his pawn was no longer his. He pulled his revolver, his eyes wild. "Savages, traitors!" he shrieked, firing his pistol wildly into the blinding storm. He hit nothing, his shots a testament to his own unraveling sanity. But his panicked outburst was witnessed. A few of the Willow Bend men, their lust for battle long since scoured away by fear, saw the government agent for what he was, a terrified, cornered rat. It was in that moment, as Whitlock's last shot echoed into the howling wind, that the storm began to thin. The wall of dust moved on, and a strange, hazy light returned to the canyon. The fighting faltered as men on both sides took in the new scene. Mallory's desperate charge had been swallowed by the desert. His men were scattered, pinned down, and defeated. And through the thinning haze, a new group of riders appeared. They were not Apache, and they were not mercenaries. They moved with the disciplined precision of soldiers, their horses fresh, their uniforms crisp despite the dust. At their head rode a stern, gray-bearded man with the cold, clear eyes of the law. Beside him was a woman, her hair pinned up tightly, a pen and notepad clutched in her hand. Judge Gaines and the journalist, Annabelle Price, had arrived. A profound, stunned silence fell over the battlefield. The crack of rifles was replaced by the weary sigh of the wind. Mallory, trapped near the base of the spire, stared in disbelief. Tyan, standing on the high ledge, lowered the rifle in his hands. Abigail, holding her trembling brother, looked from the silent telegraph key on the cliff above to the arrival of the law below. Her arrow, shot in the dark, had found its mark. The siege was over. The dust of the sandstorm settled, but the dust of conflict was thicker, choking the air with resentment and suspicion. The arrival of Judge Gaines and his contingent of federal marshals was not a celebration of victory, but the beginning of a tense and painful reckoning. The Black Spur mercenaries, their professional arrogance evaporated, were disarmed and held under guard. Owen Mallory, his fine suit now a ruined mess of dust and sweat, and Agent Whitlock, who seemed to have shrunk into himself, were placed in custody in the town's small, makeshift jail. The trial, as it came to be called, did not take place in a grand courthouse, but in the town's meeting hall, a long, narrow room that served as a church on Sundays and a dance hall on Saturdays. It was cramped, hot, and smelled of old wood, stale whiskey, and fear. Judge Gaines, a man whose stern face looked as if it had been carved from granite, presided from a simple wooden table at the front. The room was divided as if by an invisible wall. On one side sat the Apache delegation, led by a silent, watchful Tyan, with Nantan and the elders beside him. They sat with a stillness that was more intimidating than any threat. On the other side sat the people of Willow Bend, a restless, murmuring crowd, their faces a mixture of shame, defiance, and confusion. Abigail sat in the front row with her family. Her father looked 10 years older, the weight of his gamble and its near-disastrous consequences heavy on his shoulders. Her mother clutched her hand, her knuckles white. Caleb sat beside her, his head bowed, his face pale. Abigail felt like a creature of two worlds, belonging to neither. The townspeople looked at her with a mixture of awe and suspicion. The Apache looked at her with a new, undefined respect. She was the bridge, and she felt as if she might collapse under the weight. The first 2 days were consumed by the meticulous, damning testimony of the Telegraph logbook. Annabelle Price, the journalist from Santa Fe, sat near the judge, her pen flying across the pages of her notepad. Her dispatches, sent out over the now federally secured telegraph line, were already telling the story to the rest of the territory. She had a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that missed nothing, and her presence seemed to guarantee that the truth, for once, would not be buried in the dust. Judge Gaines read from the logbook, his voice a dispassionate drone that laid bare the entire conspiracy. He read Whitlock's falsified reports of Apache aggression. He read the Army's orders to maintain peace. He read the governor's message promising a mediator. And he read the final. Damning entry in the telegraph operator Silas's hand message undeliverable. With each entry, a stone was added to the wall of evidence against Mallory and Whitlock. Whitlock wilted under the weight of it, his face pasty, his denials becoming weaker and more pathetic. Mallory, however, remained defiant, his lawyer arguing technicalities and jurisdiction, his arrogance seemingly immune to fact. The turning point came on the third day, when Judge Gaines called Caleb Finch to testify. A hush fell over the room. Abigail's mother let out a small, choked sob. Caleb walked to the front of the room, his steps shuffling, his eyes fixed on the floor. He looked small and broken. At first, his voice was barely a whisper. He recounted how Agent Whitlock had found out about a gambling debt he had foolishly incurred with some of Mallory's men. It was not a large sum, but to a 16-year-old boy, it was a mountain. Whitlock had offered to clear the debt. All Caleb had to do was work for him, run errands, keep his eyes and ears open. He made it sound so important, Caleb whispered, his voice cracking. He said we were helping to build the future of the territory. He said my father was a good man, but old-fashioned, that he did not understand progress. He then told them about the ambush. Whitlock had told him he was simply to guide the Black Spur men to a meeting point, that they were going to have a talk with the Apache messengers. He told me they just wanted to scare them, Caleb said, the tears finally coming, hot and shameful. He swore no one would get hurt. I did not know. I never would have. He broke down, unable to continue. Abigail's heart broke for him. She saw not a traitor, but a foolish, frightened boy who had been expertly manipulated by a ruthless man. Whitlock lunged to his feet. Lies he is lying to save his own skin. He was a willing participant. Judge Gaines banged his gavel, the sound like a pistol shot in the tense room. Silence. Mr. Whitlock, or I will have you gagged. It was then that a voice, strong and clear, cut through the tense silence. The boy is not the only one who was a fool. Every head turned. Widow May stood up from her place among the townspeople. She was a formidable presence. Her arms crossed, her gaze sweeping over her neighbors with a look of profound disappointment. We were all fools, she said, her voice ringing with authority. All of us. We listened to Mallory's sweet promises of gold and railroad cars, and we let him feed us the same old poison of fear of the Apache. We looked across the river and saw savages because it was easier than seeing neighbors. We were so thirsty for silver that we were willing to drink blood to get it. She turned her gaze on Abigail. And this girl, we watched her be traded like a mule to keep a peace we were too cowardly to fight for ourselves. And when she came back, speaking the truth, we turned our backs on her. She has shown more courage than any man in this room, and we owe her our lives and our thanks. She sat down, her point made. A wave of shame washed through the ranks of the Willowbend men. They looked at each other, at their hands, at the floor. They had been led, like sheep, to the brink of a slaughter. And they had been saved by the very people they had been taught to despise, and by the young woman they had shunned. The rest of the hearing was a formality. The evidence was overwhelming. Judge Gaines found that there was more than enough cause to bind Owen Mallory and Agent Whitlock over for a full federal trial in Santa Fe on charges of conspiracy, incitement to violence, mail fraud, and attempting to foment an illegal war. As the marshals led them away, Mallory's face was a mask of disbelief, the face of a man who had never before encountered an obstacle he could not buy or bully his way through. For Caleb, the judge was more lenient. You were a pawn, son, he said, his voice softer than it had been all week, but you made a choice to be moved. You will not see the inside of a jail. Instead, you will spend 1 year in public service. You will work to help rebuild the trust that you helped to break. You will work with your father and with Tyen's people to establish the fair trade and cooperation that should have been in place all along. Caleb nodded, his face awash with a profound, painful relief. It was a second chance, and from the look in his eyes, he would not waste it. In the days that followed, the town of Willow Bend began the slow, difficult work of healing itself. In a town meeting, one of the militiamen, his face grim with remorse, stood up and proposed that they form a new committee, a citizens' council, to jointly oversee the telegraph office, to ensure that no single person could ever again cut them off from the truth. The motion passed unanimously. Then, one by one, the men who had ridden with Mallory walked to the front of the hall and laid their rifles on the judge's table. A quiet, symbolic surrender not to the law, but to their own better judgment. A new accord was drafted. It was not a treaty between governments, but an agreement between neighbors. Thomas Finch, his voice steady for the first time in weeks, read it aloud. It established the land around Silver Creek as a protected territory, to be managed jointly by the town and the Apache. It opened a formal, fair trading post on the banks of the river. Tyen stood beside him. He did not speak, but his presence was a powerful statement of approval. When the document was ready, he and Thomas Finch signed it, not with the flourish of politicians, but with the simple, steady hands of two fathers who had very nearly led their children into a needless war. As the meeting broke up, Abigail stood by the window, watching the sun set over the river, the water now a calm, peaceful ribbon of gold. The dust had finally settled. A new, fragile order had been born from the chaos. The law had not come from the barrel of a gun, but from the quiet, persistent scratching of Annabel Price's pen, from the damning, dusty pages of a logbook, and from the courageous, trembling voice of a boy who had chosen to tell the truth. Justice, she realized, was not always a thunderclap. Sometimes, it was just a slow, steady clearing of the air. The seasons turned, and the raw, red wounds of the land began to heal. The rains that followed the failed siege were gentle and steady, washing the dust from the air and coaxing a surprising carpet of green from the dormant earth. The Willow Bend River, which had been a line of division, slowly became a place of meeting. Under the shade of the great cottonwood trees, a new market was born. It was not a grand affair, just a collection of stalls and blankets, but it was a miracle nonetheless. On one side, the Apache women laid out their wares, intricately beaded pouches, potent herbal remedies gathered from the high mesas, and beautifully tanned deer hides, softer than velvet. On the other, the people of Willow Bend offered sacks of flour, sturdy iron tools from the blacksmith, and bolts of calico cloth. The air, which had once been thick with tension, now hummed with the unfamiliar but pleasant sound of two languages mingling in the common tongue of commerce. Abigail moved through the market, a quiet satisfaction warming her chest. She was no longer a stranger here, nor was she a simple resident of Willow Bend. She was something new, a person who belonged to the space in between, the bridge Tyen had spoken of. She saw Widow May, her face alight with the thrill of a good bargain, haggling good-naturedly with an Apache elder over a bundle of dried sage. The two women, who a few months ago would have viewed each other with suspicion across a dusty street, were now laughing, their heads close together as they argued over a handful of coins. She saw her brother, Caleb, his face and arms tanned by the sun, quietly helping his father unload a wagon of supplies as part of his public service. Caleb was tasked with managing the logistics of the new trading post. The work was hard, but it was honest, and Abigail could see the shame in his eyes being slowly replaced by a quiet, steady sense of purpose. He was rebuilding himself, one sack of flour, one respectful nod at a time. He met her gaze and offered a small, genuine smile. The wound between them was healing, too. Nantan was there, no longer a silent guard but a trusted mediator. He moved through the crowd with a relaxed confidence, his dry wit occasionally surfacing to diffuse a misunderstanding over the quality of a knife blade or the weight of a bag of corn. He was respected by both sides, a young leader coming into his own in a world his elders could never have imagined. Abigail's own work began after the morning's trading was done. In a large, open-sided wickiup that served as a makeshift schoolhouse, she had started a class. Her students were a chaotic, energetic mix of Apache children and the children of Willow Bend. She taught them their letters, writing in the dirt with a stick, and basic numbers, with Yahtzee's help. She also taught them simple medicine, how to clean a wound, how to recognize the signs of a fever, and which plants could soothe a cough or a sting. It was a place where old knowledge and new learning met, a small, hopeful seed planted in the soil of the new peace. The children, with the simple, unburdened wisdom of the young, had already forgotten to be enemies. They played together, their laughter echoing in the warm afternoon air, a sound more precious than any silver. Tyan was often there, not interfering, but watching from a distance. He was a man caught between two ages. He held fast to the traditions that had kept his people strong, but he saw the new world coming, a tide that could not be stopped. He saw in Abigail's small school a chance for his people to learn to navigate that tide, to take what was useful without losing who they were. He was leading his people not just in survival, but toward a future. One afternoon, as the market was packing up, a rider arrived from the east. He was not a soldier or a prospector, but a mail carrier, and he had a letter for Abigail. It was from Annabelle Price. Abigail opened the envelope, her heart beating a little faster. Annabelle's letter was filled with news. Her articles, published in the Santa Fe newspaper, had caused a sensation. The story of Mallory's greed, Whitlock's treachery, and the unlikely alliance that had stopped a war had been picked up by papers back east. She wrote that the territorial governor, embarrassed by the actions of his appointed agent, had made the Silver Creek Accord a centerpiece of his new policy. Federal surveyors were on their way, not to map out a mine, but to officially designate the Sacred Canyon and the surrounding lands as a co-managed protectorate, the first of its kind. The small, handwritten agreement signed in the Willow Bend meeting hall was on its way to becoming federal law. You did not just save a town or a piece of land. Abigail, Annabelle had written in her neat, decisive script, you may have shown us all a new way forward. The West does not have to be a story of conquest. Perhaps it can be a story of cooperation. That evening, as the sun began its slow, magnificent descent, painting the sky in strokes of rose and gold, Abigail walked with Tyan along the riverbank. It was the same path she had walked in the terrifying days after her arrival, but now the land felt like home. She read him the letter, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. He listened in his usual thoughtful silence, his gaze fixed on the slow, steady current of the river. This Annabelle Price is a woman of strong words, he said when she had finished. Her words will protect this place long after we are gone, Abigail said softly. Words on paper can be erased, he cautioned, though there was a current of hope in his voice. The true peace is not in her newspaper or in the governor's laws. It is here. He gestured to the quiet sounds of the evening, to the distant laughter from the settlement, to the smoke rising from her father's chimney across the water. It is in the daily work of being neighbors. It will not be easy. The old fears have long roots. But we will face it, Abigail said, looking up at him. Together. He stopped walking and turned to face her, in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. The hard lines of his face seemed to soften. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw none of the burdened leader or the stoic warrior. She saw only the man, a man who had found an unexpected peace in the heart of a political storm. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was as familiar and comforting as her own heartbeat. Their love had not been a lightning strike, a sudden, passionate flame. It had grown slowly, quietly, like a hardy desert plant putting down deep roots in rocky soil. It had been nurtured by shared danger, by mutual respect, and by the simple, profound discovery of the goodness in each other's hearts. The forced pact of a desperate treaty had, against all odds, blossomed into the free and deliberate choice of two people to build a life together. My father traded you for peace, Tyan said, his voice a low murmur. It is the only time a bad trade has brought me a great treasure. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood together in the fading light. watching the river flow on. The water was a timeless symbol of the journey that had brought them here, a constant, moving current that washed away the past and flowed, full of promise, toward the open horizon of an unknown future. The world beyond this small, peaceful valley would continue to churn with the relentless push of progress and the hunger for land. And new challenges would surely come with the turning of the seasons. But here, on the banks of the Willow Bend River, a man and a woman who had once been worlds apart stood together, their hands intertwined, their hearts at peace, ready to meet whatever came next, as one. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.